Welcome, everyone, and thank you for joining us today for EMBCA's The Effects of the Hellenic Revolution on Medicine, Health, and Wellness in Greece, America, and Europe. This East Mediterranean Business Culture Alliance event is in association with the HEPAS Hellenic Cultural Commission and the Hellenic-American National Council. My name is Lou Katsos. I'm EMBCA's president, founder, and chairman of a HEPAS Hellenic Cultural Commission. I will be the moderator today, and my co-moderator will be Dr. Sotirios Stergiopoulos. The distinguished panel for today's unique event will include author, engineer, president of the Pammachon Cultural Union, Kostas Dervenis, orthopedic surgeon, Hellenic Army Major Dr. Evangelos Tsialogiannis, Jennifer Arnott of the research librarian of the Perkins School for the Blind, and Lisa Norberg, the library director of the Cooper Union for the Advancement of Science and Art. Greece in 1821 was the first independent nation state to successfully break away from the Ottoman Empire. Philhellenism and neoclassicism, the precursors to the revolution, led Europeans such as Lord Byron and Charles Fabrier to advocate internationally for Hellenic independence from the Ottoman Empire. But it was the revolution itself that lit the match and resulted in a tremendous dispersion of knowledge, customs, beliefs, and practices. The Hellenes under the Ottomans had turned the tables on their oppressors while still under their administration. During the 17th, 18th, and 19th centuries, Hellenes had more and better schools than any other people in the Balkans. Behind this achievement lies their performance in trade and commerce on land and sea that created a network in the West and East, boosting their self-confidence, bringing knowledge and experience, and empowering a once subjected nation. Spyridon Trikoupis, a scholar who lived through and fought in the revolution, wrote, "The Hellenes, despite being dominated, excelled and progressed. The revolution led to the dispersion of knowledge and practices in health, medicine, and wellness throughout the world." This panel will discuss precisely those factors and how they affected Western societies, emphasizing the contributions of John Zachos, Samuel Gridley Howe, Michael Anagnos, Panagiotis Soutsos, Evangelos Zappas, and Heinrich Treiber, among others. As examples, Samuel Gridley Howe, who fought in the revolution, was a 19th century well-known American physician, abolitionist, and an advocate of education for the blind. Michael Anagnos was the second director of the Perkins School for the Blind and a noted author, educator, human rights activist, and well-known for his work with Helen Keller. And John Zachos was a Hellenic-American physician, literary scholar, elocutionist, author, lecturer, inventor, and educational pioneer, as well as an early proponent of equal education rights for African Americans and women. He was also a professor and library curator at the Cooper Union. This event and others we have had are part of EMBCA's American Hellenic Revolution of 1821 Bicentennial Committee series of events, focusing not only on the revolution, but also importantly on the American diaspora and international aspects and influences of the revolution for its 200th anniversary. My co-moderator today is Dr. Sotirios Stergiopoulos. He is a physician executive with leading expertise in the field of pharmaceutical biotechnology, especially in oncology. He is the president and chief executive officer of A2A Pharmaceuticals and maintains a seat on the board of directors. He is on the board of directors of Recover Healthcare. His previous experience includes chief medical officer and senior vice president and head of global medical affairs in Ipsen, and leading roles in oncology, research and development in companies such as Bayer and Novartis. He has held appointments as an attending physician and trained in institutions such as the Albert Einstein College of Medicine, Harvard Medical School, and the National Institutes of Health. He is a fellow of the American College of Physicians, fellow of the New York Academy of Medicine, as well as the Fellow Royal Society of Medicine. He is also a member of the American Association of Cancer Research and the American Society of Clinical Oncology. He has held the role of chairman for scholarships for the Hellenic Medical Society, as well as being the chairman of medical scholarships for the Order of HEPA Delphi Chapter 25. He has won numerous awards given by the American Cancer Society for his long-standing dedication and commitment to fighting cancer. Sotirios has been moderating in the past of EMBCA's The Evolution of the Pharma and Biotech Industry in the 21st Century panel discussion. Welcome, Sotirios, and thank you for being a co-moderator today.
Oh, thank you. Thank you, Lou. This is a great opportunity to be able to speak about some very important issues in the 200-year anniversary that we have of this wonderful country of ours, and to get some great understanding of what our people went through and what it means to us today in our lives. So thanks for letting me be part of this.
No, it's certainly our pleasure. I'd like to introduce the first panelist. Many of us, of course, know him. He has been with us before. Kostas Dervenis is a chemical engineer and materials engineer with a background in airframe design. He has studied martial arts for more than 50 years and is the current headmaster of the Pammachon Hellenic Combatives Martial Education System. A renowned researcher of martial arts and their history, his work was referenced by Bethany Hughes in her book, Helen of Troy, and he was cited as an expert on Bronze Age combat in the accompanying Channel 4 documentary. Kostas' book, The Martial Arts of Ancient Greece, has been included as a reference for the degree program at the U.S. Army War College. He is a consistent collaborator of the Hellenic Armed Forces and NATO. His paper, The Neurophysiological and Evolutionary Considerations of Close Combat, a Modular Approach, written together with Major Tsialogiannis, who is also on our panel, and which was derived from his work with the Hellenic military and Pammachon, received an honorary distinction at the 4th International Medical Olympiad. Having served in the past as the engineering manager of the Peace Xenia Greek F-16 program, he is currently working as a senior sales manager for the Hellenic Software Company, in Brussels, Belgium. As I indicated before, he has been a panelist with us before, and panelist in EMBCA's Warrior Arts of the Hellenes, from ancient times to the modern era. Welcome, Kostas, and thank you for being with us.
Thank you, Lou. Pleasure to be here again. The introduction makes me sound a lot meaner than I actually am. It's not true, but hopefully today I'll deal with something less violent than the previous panels and what you described.
Thank you. Please go on with your brief presentation.
Okay, so you'd like me to start.
Yes.
Can we have the presentation, Konstantina, put on screen? Excellent. Excellent. So what I wanted to emphasize were the effects of the Hellenic Revolution on modern athletics and fitness. I mean, what characterizes our life around the world today? What do we miss in these times of quarantine? Sports. You can't go to the gym. You can't watch sports being played. I think we've taken it for granted how much fitness, sports, wellness, all these things have become a part of our life, an institutional structure. And the question is, did the Hellenic Revolution itself play a part in the establishment of this in the psyche of people around the globe? Well, the answer is yes, it did. Now, before we approach it, I want to make a very functional point. We are talking, when we say the Hellenic Revolution, we are talking about the establishment of the Hellenic Republic as an independent state. We are not talking about Hellenism per se, because as you pointed out in your original, in your introduction, the Hellenes were doing very well financially under the Ottoman Empire. They had turned the tables. As Spyridon Trikoupis said, the revolution happened because we knew we would win, or at least at the time we thought we would win before we started fighting amongst ourselves. So we were doing okay, but what happened was that the revolution instituted a separate Hellenic Republic, and that is very important for the history of modern athletics, as we will see. Next slide, please. Okay, so we know that the reason that the Greek Revolution happened was because neoclassicism became very popular. Okay, the point of the matter was that 16th, 17th, and 18th European society had essentially fallen in love with Greece, or their ideal perception, or the perception of an ideal Greece, an ideal classical world that was a kind of a combination for them between Hellas and Rome, and whatever they could recreate from the excavations that had actually happened. And it's not coincidental that the rediscovery of Pompeii and Herculaneum set off this spark. So neoclassicism was actually born in Rome from a German, Johann Winckelmann. He was a very, very interesting character. He was a homosexual who became the head librarian of the Vatican. So you can imagine the personality involved and the political machinations that this person was capable of. He was also one of the founders of scientific archaeology. So he, being an artist himself and having studied art history, he was able to differentiate between the different periods in classical history, which, believe it or not, beforehand, they were not able to do that. So he was the one who actually got the ball rolling with his History of Art in Antiquity, which was published in 1764. And still today, it's considered as the textbook as far as European culture in ancient times. Next slide, please. So neoclassicism affected everybody. Okay, you're talking about a time of continuous exploration. The New World had been discovered. People, the empires were starting to become global. Goods were being transferred all over the globe. And what happens when that happens is people start turning inwards, and they start questioning their own societies, their own selves, rather than trying to ameliorate, let's say, the bad things in our own societies. Whenever that happens, we often turn elsewhere and idealize other cultures and other things. I mean, the most recent example is the 60s, for example, in the hippies movement, which turned eastward and brought back an idealized version of Eastern culture. So the same thing happened with neoclassicism in Europe. Everything became neoclassic: art, sculpture, literature, fashion, architecture, and athletics, as we will see, but philosophy, government, everybody wanted to somehow get their fingers into the neoclassic pie. Napoleon did very much in disseminating this feeling. He is often given a bad rap when taking into consideration the later years of his rule, let's say, but he actually started out quite idealistic and as a child of the French Revolution. So at the end, of course, he styled himself as an emperor, and he took neoclassic symbols to impose the inscription of his rule, amongst which the eagle, bee, stars, and other things, chariots, Apollo, Hermes. The interesting thing with Napoleon is he disseminated a lot of this new thought because it was also politically revolutionary. For example, Napoleon was one of the first people who introduced conscription into the armed forces, which was something that was new at the time. Most of the soldiers were professionals. So he disseminated a lot of things, changed a lot of structure. A lot of it was based on how he perceived, or this idealized neoclassic version of the world. But the British were even more centered on Greece itself. Many of the authors, such as Alexander Pope or Jonathan Swift, found inspiration in the classical period and reflected that in their works. And of course, they set the stage for the greatest Philhellene of them all, George Gordon, Lord Byron. Next slide, please. Okay, so Byron was the one who was our public affairs office. Okay, he was the one who, with his Childe Harold saga, which became widely popular, started emphasizing the contrast between the glories of ancient Greece, which the Europeans took for granted, and the servile humiliation that the Greeks suffered under the Ottoman Empire. I tend to disagree with that. I will say that yes, if he went out into the middle and saw a peasant who, wasn't involved in the scheme of things, perhaps that person was perceived as suffering. But if he traveled amongst the merchant class, obviously the Greeks were doing quite well under the Ottoman Empire. But in any case, Byron wrote that it was Greece, 'tis Greece, but live in Greece no more, so coldly sweet, so deadly fair, and the soul is wanting there, etc. So he was the one who inspired the British public to finance, basically, the Hellenic Revolution. There were other people, for example, in Germany, Friedrich Hölderlin, in Hyperion, and again, here in that novel, he's portraying a young Greek who's trying to raise awareness of his country's plight, etc., etc. According to Byron, ancient Greece was the burial grounds of lost Western civilization. Now, this is a very, very important statement on his part, because that statement was basically responsible for the incorporation of neoclassic ideals into athleticism. Okay, so the Phoenix of Hellas had to rise from its ashes, and that resurrection could take many forms. And one of those was classical athleticism. So the idea was to duplicate and imitate what the ancient Greeks did for health. One of the phrases that was propagated was nous iis and somati iis, which unfortunately was Roman, not Greek, and it was coined by Juvenalis, but nevertheless, the Greek translation is what survived. Next slide, please. So, throughout this process in the 16th and 17th centuries, reaching into the 18th and 19th, they started to incorporate athletic games into the psyche and practice of the people. In other words, it became a thing to start competing like the classical athletes did. So we see our first Olympiad in France, in revolutionary France, in 1796, where 4 sporting events were held in front of 300,000 people. Now that's an incredible crowd, if you can imagine that. If you've been to the Champ de Mars and you can imagine 300,000 people there, it was packed. It's like a small city being held in this place. And what did they do? They had running events, so they ran track. But because this was the entry into the Napoleonic era, and all these things were military, okay? You cannot exclude the connection at the time between the military and the athletic competition, because basically athletic competitions were held so that you could have strong soldiers. In fact, what are we talking about? We're talking about the field of Mars. So they held the Olympic Games on the field of Mars. So they had horse races primarily, because that was what the military, let's say, emphasis was at the time. They had a horse race, a chariot race, and a ring race, which was a lancer's competition. They would ride 6 lamps around the Champ de Mars, and then they would try to snatch rings with the tip of their lance as they pass. So quite an intriguing, difficult, and innovative competition. Not really classical sports as of yet, but they were heading that way. There was another one in 1798, also held in France, which included wrestling. And then they changed up the running races into different distances. So that was the first thing where you had sprints and you had long distance running. It also marked the introduction of the metric system into sports. And of course, the British could not stay far behind in seeing that. So the first athletics competitions were held in 1812 at the Royal Military College in Sandhurst, and then others in Shropshire and the Shrewsbury School. There was another competition in 1849 after the revolution. In 1850, we'll talk about that. The Wenlock Olympic Games were actually kind of famous. They essentially established the charter for the Olympic Games that the International Olympic Committee that we are using now. But let's go into that a little bit later. So next slide, please. So you have this gestation, okay, of people looking at an idealized version of Greece and wondering, what did the Athenians do? What did the Spartans do? And here we come to the rugby school, which is very important because this is after the Hellenic Revolution, okay? So this is, or in the middle of it, let's say. So Thomas Arnold was the headmaster of the rugby school from 1828 to 1841, and he introduced a number of reforms. Basically, he was the one who incorporated the athletic competitions, redefining competitions based on masculinity and achievement and centering it on how he perceived ancient Hellenic principles, okay? And then there were a number of Olympic-style events. After that, there were the Liverpool Olympics, which were an annual festival held between 1862 and 1867. And in 1865, a National Olympian Association was actually founded in Liverpool as a forerunner of the British Olympic Association. But let's go on, because I think you're getting the idea, and the idea is that neoclassicism, Byron, all these things led to the reestablishment of sport as a concept within the European psyche. Next slide, please. Okay, so we did not lag behind. Lou, I think you did a panel on Rigas, and you know Rigas was talking about the Olympic Games and long before the revolution, while he was doing his writing in the Balkans at that time. But during the revolution, as soon as the War of Independence was formally announced, Panagiotis Soutsos, in actually 1831, that's incorrect, published in 1831 in Nafplion, his Dialogue of the Dead, where he portrays the spirit of Plato returning to Greece to gaze upon it in despair. And Soutsos was unfortunately very, very anti-Kapodistrios, who had just been murdered when this was published. And he is a ghost in this poem. It's not very flattering towards Kapodistrios. In fact, it's painful to read if you know something about the man. But in this play, Plato has, or Soutsos has, the ghost of Plato ask Kapodistrios, where are your Olympic Games? Okay, so where are your theaters? Where are yours this? Where is that? So the idea of the Greek Revolution, that the Greeks didn't understand or didn't have their eyes on their own past, that's erroneous. Most of the intellectuals were in fact looking for a rebirth of classical Greece with the Greek Revolution. And 2 years later, or 4 years later, Soutsos followed this up with a letter to the Greek Minister of the Interior, Yannis Koletis, proposing that Olympic Games be held every March 25th. Next slide, please. Okay. So let's get closer to home. Evangelos Zappas was of Vlachos. He was an Aromanian Greek from the village of Labovo, near Agirotisto in northern Epirus. And he was the principal backer and benefactor of the modern Olympics. So during his youth, Zappas actually fought in the War of Independence, where he rose to the rank of major. He was always Kaptan Vangelis to his men. And following Greek independence, he moved to Romania, Vlachia, where he made a fortune in land and agriculture, becoming one of the richest men in Europe. So Zappas first wrote to King Otto in Greece in January of 1856, offering to fund a permanent revival of the Olympic Games. Nothing happened. It was ignored by the court at the time until, again, Panagiotis Soutsos published the letter that July. And then, of course, under the political pressure, King Otto agreed to the organization of athletic competitions at 4-year intervals with Zappas' sponsorship. He also forced him to pay for industrial and agricultural expos. So if you want Olympic Games, you have to pay for factories and large farms to come in and display or industrial agriculture to come in and display their concepts as well. The first Olympic Games actually were held in Athens in 1859, in the Pedio Tuarios, the Field of Mars again, and athletes participated from all over Greece and the Ottoman Empire. So they were in fact international. Next slide, please. And here we go now to our homeland. We will be talking about Michael Anagnos shortly. Jennifer will, but the mountains behind me are Papingo, and both Vangelis and I are Papingiotis. And we actually had something to do with the Olympics being a thing. Again, Zacharias Sardelis was a compatriot of ours. He was a reporter, teacher, author, and philosopher. He was also the secretary of Evangelos Zappas in Bucharest. He was the drafter of Zappas's will, creating the 13 articles that had to do with the Olympic Games. Now, what actually Zappas had put in the will and how he saw the Olympic Games can be highlighted by what he put in his will to fund them. He said that Greeks everywhere around the world, should send every 4 years committees to Athens, where there will be a permanent committee, and they will confer on the interests of our people. And of course, that hasn't happened, but that was the original intention. So Zappas intended that the Olympic Games be an ambassador for Hellas to the world. So Sardelis was a very, very tough SOB. Zappas left his money to Konstantinos Zappas, his cousin. Neither of them had kids. So yeah, we're talking about unbelievable amounts of wealth, billions in today's currency. So Evangelos left it to Konstantinos. When Konstantinos died in 1892, the Romanian government, unfortunately, provoked and sponsored by some distant kin of Zappas from Greece, seized his assets. So the money was gone. And Sardelis was one of the witnesses in the case so that Greece could get that money back. He was the victim of an assassination attempt when he was in his 70s, and it cost him his eye. So if you see photos of him today, he'll have a black monocle over one eye. But that tough old man, late 70s, fought off 2 attackers, and then because of that, he was subsequently exiled to Gaesti, during the Balkan Wars, where he died in 1913. But that is, let's say, our second contribution to the world after Michael Anagnos. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. So, Zappas, who was from northern Epirus, after all this happened, and before, because Konstantinos backed it, of course, funded the second Olympic Games after his first, okay? These were the first that were actually held in the refurbished Panathinaikos Stadium, which we will see shortly on. So after a period of litigation, what we talked about, Konstantinos got the money and continued to expand his endowment of the Games and maintained his efforts for continuation of the Olympic spirit. So the second Olympic Games were held in Greece. In 1870, they were the first modern games to be hosted in a stadium, and they were attended by 25,000 people and by athletes from all over Europe and all over the Ottoman Empire. And a third iteration of the games was held in 1875. We don't know what happened. No records were kept of those. The second games, I believe, is when the transition period also happened between the Bavarian regime and the Danish regime, the Glücksburgs coming in. I think that was 1868, if I remember correctly. So the hiccup between the previous games and the games in 1870 also had to do with the change in the ruling family of Athens. Next slide, please. And finally, you know, we are getting to the Olympics that we all know, the first Olympics that were sponsored by the International Olympic Committee. The Baron de Coubertin was very focused on physical education and the role of athletics in schooling. Okay. However, the dates are not concise. The first time he visited England was 1883, where he, for the first time, saw the program of physical education that was instituted by Thomas Arnold at the rugby school. So de Coubertin was not a supporter of neoclassic athletics before that. He saw that there in 1883. Greece had already held 3 Olympics by then. Okay, so he pushed it toward the end. The inclusion of physical education in the curriculum of French schools was something that was a passion of Coubertin's, and he was the one who made it happen. Now, de Coubertin entered into a neoclassicism very late. He had an even more romantic version of ancient Greece than his predecessors, and he began to develop his own theory of physical education, where his ideal example was the Athenian gymnasium, or what he perceived to be the gymnasium. And he perceived a unity between old and young, between disciplines, and between different types of people. And this is what he was trying to achieve with his own Olympic ideal. Next slide, please. So de Coubertin is French. He's famous. He's a baron. He comes into Greece and finds that there is money left for the Olympics. So in 1894, they formed the International Olympic Committee, and a Greek, Dimitris Vikelas, is his first president. They planned and held the 1896 Olympic Games, which of course set off a spark around the world. But clearly, as Professor David Young of the University of Florida writes, had it not been for Zappas, there would be no Olympics, basically. Okay. Zappas' actions, his will, and the previous tradition of Zappas's Olympic Games is what made Prince Constantine at that time, not the king, the prince, an advocate of the Olympic Games before the formation of the International Olympic Committee in 1894. Next slide. And here are the 1896 Games. It's amazing. This was a photo that was shared just last week by the U.S. Embassy in Athens. Isn't it amazing to see, you know, all those people there, international games, athletes from all over the world in 1896 in Athens. And this is what really set off the spark for amateur sports, for fitness, for wellness, for competition games, everything that's happening around the world that's so much a part of our lives today. This is what set it off. It would not have happened if there was not a Hellenic Revolution, quite simply. Next slide. And here we see the Zapion Megaron, the cultural center bequeathed by Zappas. Actually, it was originally an industrial and agricultural center. But then he managed to switch it to a cultural center. But these are the fencing competitions that were being held in 1896, which were won by Greeks for the most part. So it's very interesting. And next slide, please. Okay, so I'm going to segue very quickly and talk about Pammachon in the same context, or martial education in the same context, because this type of wellness curriculum, which I suspect we'll hear more about, all I want to say is that, and the reason I put this in there, because there was a recent conversation with some of my students in Greece who are convinced that what you're seeing was a derogation of the French and British schools. But this is actually earlier, because the sports did not mature at rugby until 1840 or so, and de Coubertin did not visit England until 1883. Savate and the Bâton Militaire matured in France throughout the 19th century, but they took proper form only in the late 19th. Now, it could be that German and Danish influence in Hellas affected these type of practices. And it was the Danish King George I who issued a decree that martial education in 1865 be included in the system of education for Hellenic school children. And that was subsequently exported by Greek interest groups and non-cultural foundations into the Ottoman Empire. So we start with martial education in Greece in 1865, and we see it exported to the Ottoman Empire over the tail end of the 19th century. And next slide, please. Okay, and the reason that I'm pointing this out is, again, this goes back to a particular conversation that had to do with the baton. What you're seeing on the left is a 16th century depiction of the Epirot, of Epirotes, a man and a woman. What he's carrying on his shoulder is a stick weapon, long before you saw such things in Europe. And we have records of those in the Byzantine Empire. And I'm not claiming anything. I'm just saying that all sport and wellness training originally started out with a military character. The games were held on the fields of Mars. So who knows? Next slide, please. Okay, and this is what I want to stress, and this is how then the message that I want to give in this presentation today, and I hope I wasn't too long-winded. But were it not for the Hellenic Revolution and the neoclassicism of Europe that led to the Hellenic Revolution, we would not have athletics spread throughout the world today. Or maybe we would, but not as we know them, okay? It was, in fact, the Hellenic Revolution, the fact that Zappas left all his legacy to Hellas to restore the Olympic Games, and he wanted to do it περί των συμφερόντων του γένους, to help the Hellenic people, there would be no Olympics. And again, the question is, were it not for the Olympic Games, would sport and wellness have evolved to their modern shape throughout the world? Would modern athletics and fitness be as widespread? Would they be a positive influence, the positive influence that they are in everyone's lives in every country in the world today? I don't think so, but that's just me, and I'm a Greek, so I have to take the position that, you know, were it not for us, et cetera, et cetera. I think that concludes my presentation.
Thank you, Kostas. And after listening to this, it further reinforces in at least my mind, you know, that discussion of where do you have the Olympic Games, and to have that discussion again and say, you know what, This is where it started. This is the background. And some of the stuff you went over is perfect. And maybe the Olympic Games should happen every 4 years in Greece, where it started. So thank you for that, and we'll come back to some questions later.
Lou, just one point for that. I actually think it was with the 2004 Olympics. I actually took a Japanese sprinter to Olympia, who was a friend of a friend, and he ran on the track. The guy was in tears. Okay, so the effect of this thing, even on Olympic class athletes, you know what you're saying. If the games could be held, the effect on them was shattering. The guy's fingers were shaking. You know, I mean, he was in tears. Literally, this could be a positive thing both for the world and for Hellas.
Kostas, I could say that as a former aspiring Olympic athlete back in the day, and having two boys with an aspiration of 2028 Olympics with one of them, I could tell you that walking there actually weakened my knees and brought me to a more than, I would say, a humbling moment, knowing where I came from and what I hope to one day see for all of us.
Well, I'm not an Olympic athlete, but my hands were shaking too when I did it. Yeah.
Our next presenter is Dr. Evangelos Tsialogiannis. He is an orthopedic surgeon with subspecial practice in lower limb reconstruction surgery and complex trauma. He graduated from the Military Academy of Combat Supporting Officers. He's currently holding the rank of Major in the Hellenic Army. He has served as a trauma surgeon in many places around the Hellenic Revolution and during the Yugoslavia Civil War. It was then that he was decorated with the UN medal. He is a double-trained surgeon, graduate from the University of Toronto, and member of the Royal College of Surgeons in England. From 2019, he has worked as a consultant in the UK NHS. His main interest is minimal invasive techniques in hip replacement and robotics. He is a keen athlete and has participated in open sea swimming races in the Aegean. Welcome, Kostas, and please start with your presentation. Thank you.
Thank you, Luis. You can call me Vangelis.
Evangelos.
So, thank you for the invitation, and the panel is really very interesting. And can we have my presentation? All right. So, I was trying to find something to connect Hellenic Revolution and medicine, and I've talked with Kostas a lot about that, but the only thing we could find was some documents about vaccinations. And I thought I would like to present a few things about trauma and military medicine during the first time that we have some written documents in the history of humankind. And this is 3,000 years ago during the Trojan War. So there is a poet which was written by Omeros. The next slide, please. So back then, people used to believe that illnesses should be sent from a god as a punishment, and the treatment for that would be like sacrifice animals or even humans. So as we go on through time, the ancient Greeks believed that if we combine logic, then we can get rid of the magicians and set up the fundamental basics for medicine. Next slide, please. So the first documents we have for how we treat an open wound, how we set up different surgical techniques, how do we give specific antibiotics and healing ointments in open wounds, use of bandages, and new sterilization methods, or even amputation techniques, And the first scripts for musculoskeletal anatomy was from Homer, and that was 800 BC. Next slide, please. So Homeros was a poet and who wrote two poets. The first one was Iliada, and the other one was the Adventures of Ulysses. I will focus on Iliada, which is a war poet. On that, we can see there were two doctors. One of them was Machaon, and the other one was Podarilios. The Machaon was a military surgeon, and the Podarilios was a pathologist. They were both brothers. Asclepius was their father. And during that point, we can see that famous soldiers like Achilles, Ulysses, Patroclus were very famous in not only how they fight, but as well in how they would treat their wounds and how they heal them. Next slide, please. So if we go back to Asclepius' genealogical tree, we can see that his father was Apollo, so his father was a god, and he had four children. Two of them was the doctors who went to the Trojan War, the Machaon and the Podalirios, and the other one was Panacea in Aegea. Next slide, please. So in Homeros, we can see a few episodes on how the ancient Greeks used to treat their wounds. So the first episode was Philoctetes. So Philoctetes was a king of Thessaly, and during the Trojan War, he was bitten by a snake, and he was left in Tenedos. Tenedos is a small island across Troy. So his wound got very infected, and it was septic. So the Greeks let him stay on that island. But there was also a prophecy saying that they could not conquer Troy without Philoctetes. So they brought him back to Troy, and they let Machaon take care of his wound. So it was the first written documentation of surgical debridement of a wound, and then by a surgeon. And then Podarilios was taking over the surgeon and tried to heal the wound by giving him antibiotics and healing ointments made from wine and therapeutic plants that this doctor brought from his father, Asclepius. So it was the first time in history where two different specialties were being collaborated to treat a limb-threatening situation. Next slide, please. And there we can see Machaon treating Philoctetes' wound in a seal ring. Next, please. The second episode is with Menelaus. Menelaus is a king of Mycenae, a very strong kingdom, but he was the poor husband because Helen, his wife, cheated on him with Paris. So Menelaus challenged Paris to fight with him. Paris is the lover who stole Helen. And during that fight, Menelaus got injured. So Machaon removed the tip of the spear from his foot. And on that, we can see details from Homeros about the anatomy of the area with tendons and the muscles and the bones. Next slide, please. And there is a picture where we can see the Machaon taking care of Menelaus. Next, please. And there we can see another episode with Achilles and another warrior, Telephos. Telephos was a great warrior, and Achilles was a very known king, semi-god, and very good warrior. So Telephos got injured during the fight, and Achilles was treating his wound by putting copper debris from the tip of his spear. So many years ago, we found out that copper proved to be bacteriostatic. Next, please. And this is not a very good picture, but we can see Achilles treating Telephus wounds with copper. Next, please. So, as a conclusion, we believe that the ancient Greeks believed that war was the father of all, as by Heraclitus. And then what they gave us was the logic of way of thinking, and that replaced eventually magic. And because of Homer, we have the first written documents about the human body anatomy, about the first military doctors in history, and about the two different divisions, the surgical division and the pathologic division. And we have also the first written documentation about the surgical techniques, about the wound debridement, how to close the wound, and how to do a safe amputation or even foreign body removals. We have also documentations about wound healing ointments and antibiotics. And I guess this is the legacy that this poet gave to the humanity. Next, please. This is a written document by Newton, the British physics. So in this document, we can see that he's describing the way the military doctors in Trojan was treating the wounds according to Homer. Next, please. And this is a picture from Yugoslavia when I was transferred there during the civil war in 2004. This is an American-based hospital where they're treating a septic infection in a soldier's belly. So, as a conclusion, I would like to say that because of the Greeks, there was a transition between the divine way of treating injuries to a more logical way of treating injuries. And this is the beginning of medicine. And I think that the war, despite all these bad consequences that gives to the humanity, if we search very carefully, we can see that it gives also a brand new ideas of evolution. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Evangelos. And certainly it was a fascinating presentation relating to Homer and the Iliad. After listening to some of what you were saying, I thought they were more advanced than anything that was happening up to the 19th century, to be honest with you. Very, very fascinating. Our next presenter is going to be Jennifer Arnott. Jennifer has been a research librarian at the Hayes Research Library at Perkins School for the Blind since 2015. She is a graduate of Wesley College and the Dominican University, St. Catherine University, MLS, MLIS program. The Hayes Research Library is the largest non-medical collection focusing on blindness, visual impairment, and deaf blindness in the United States. Jennifer also works with the National Center on Deaf Blindness, a federal technical assistance project to provide research and resource services to the project staff and the educators and the families they support. Welcome, Jennifer, and thank you for being with us today.
It is a pleasure. If we could move right on to the second slide when you get them up, that would be fantastic. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the Health as Foundation for Learning, focusing, of course, on Perkins, because that is the piece I know the most about. And in particular, I'm going to talk about our first two directors, Samuel Gridley Howe, and in the very Americanized version of his name, Michael Anagnos is how we have always referred to him. He was originally Anagnos, I believe, if I get the emphasis right. And I'm going to talk about Perkins as a school, the causes of blindness, environment, health concerns and physical training. And from the presentations already today, we were doing physical training very early, and I will talk about that. Next slide, please. Samuel Gridley Howe was our founding director. He was born in 1801 and died in 1876. He was, as has been mentioned, a medical doctor. He went to Brown University. And when he graduated, he went to fight in the Greek Revolution following Lord Byron. He got there a few months after Byron died. And he stayed and he both fought and provided medical assistance. So he, towards the later part of this period, he was sort of overseeing medical services and treatments. He came back from that. The story goes that he ran into Jonathan Dix Fisher, also a very well-known doctor in the Boston area, on Newbury Street in Boston. And Fisher had been part of the process for chartering the first school for the blind in the United States. And they were looking for a director. And the story goes that he ran into Howe and said, "Oh, you would be perfect for this." And Howe spent a year or so traveling around Europe, looking at what schools were doing there, and then came back, and in 1832, Perkins was opened as a school. Most of this time period, we were known as the Perkins Institution and Massachusetts Asylum for the Blind. So if you're looking for a name, that's the one you should probably aim at. Howe is, besides all of this, he is also well known for other things. He was an abolitionist and activist. His wife was Julia Ward Howe. They were both very active abolitionists. He established, besides blindness education, he was the first person to teach somebody who was deafblind sort of formal education skills. That was Laura Bridgman, who came to Perkins in 1837. And we say that without Laura, there would have been no Helen Keller, to give you an idea of how important she was in deafblind education. She wrote journals, she wrote thousands of letters. We have descriptions of her dreams. She was an amazing seamstress. We still have some of her sewing material. And she remained at Perkins as a teacher up through the 1880s when she died. One thing many people don't actually know about Howe is that he was involved in the early research about and the first school for intellectually disabled students anywhere in the United States, what later became the Fernald School. We have early research from him that identifies artistic behaviors in what we believe is some of the first sort of formal scientific research that names those behaviors in ways that we would identify pretty clearly. He also founded the Massachusetts State Board of Charities, which was looking to improve health in the almshouses and the other charitable institutions of the state. Next slide, please. Michael Anagnos was born in 1837 and died in 1906. He was a journalist originally. He came from a small farming family in Papengo, but his family were very insistent that he become educated, and so he did go to university. The journalism became very complicated around the time of the Revolt of Crete in 1865. And so he became secretary to Howe, who was there as a result of the revolt. And when Howe came back to the United States, he invited Anagnos to come with him. This worked out very well for him. If you look at the later part of his history, he married Howe's eldest daughter, Julia Romana Howe, in 1870. When Howe's health started declining, he became the second director of Perkins in 1875. And he's best known today for two things. He founded the kindergarten, which was the first school for children who were blind, by which we mean anywhere under about 9, anywhere in the United States. And there wasn't really anything quite like this in Europe either. And he is, of course, very well known for being instrumental in the education of both Anne Sullivan and Helen Keller, who I'm now going to ignore for the rest of this talk, unusually from me talking about things at Perkins. Next slide, please. To give you a little bit of sense of what we're talking about in terms of the buildings, the photographs that you can see, the large square building on the left that looks like a hotel is in fact a former hotel. It was first bought by the school in 1837. And it has a lot of individual rooms. It has those porches on the front. It had a lot of space, although not nearly enough space. Over time, the school expanded, taking up about 2 blocks of space in South Boston. The photograph at the top right is the new, quote unquote, new library building, which was built in the 1870s. And you can see that there are these rows of shelves going back. The books at the time were embossed type, even more than Braille. And if you've ever seen embossed type books or Braille, they physically take up a lot of space. So storage was always an issue. The physicality of moving books around was always an issue. And the other part I want to highlight is this idea of cottages. So Perkins was the first place to sort of pioneer putting children in home-like environments as residential students. So the cottages held 10 to 15 students, a couple of staff members, and usually one domestic staff person who would do the cooking and the heavy cleaning and the laundry. The idea was that this would allow people to integrate back into family life when they left school. They would be able to take part in the household chores. They would be able to act independently in the house. Throughout the time that Perkins was in South Boston, they did not have a chance to expand this to the boys. They just didn't have the physical space to create more cottages. But these days, now that once we moved to Watertown in 1912, where we are now, the boys also have their own cottages. And this is an ongoing practice at Perkins. Next slide, please. So what is Perkins doing here? We were the first school for the blind chartered in the United States in 1829. We and several other schools opened in 1832 because it took them a little while to figure out how to do this school thing. Howe had visited schools for the blind in France and in Austria and in a couple of other places, but they were much more institutional. He was very concerned about providing active education, training people towards hopefully lifelong independence. And it took a while to figure out how to do that. We moved to the South Boston site we were at for most of this time in 1837. And the school was a balance of academic work, music, and physical training. Music was extremely important. From the second teacher they hired was a music teacher, because it was seen as the high status job that somebody who was blind could do easily. They could be a music teacher, they could be a church organist. A little later in this period, they could be a piano tuner. For a long time, Perkins held the piano tuning contracts for the Boston public school system. So you can imagine a lot of pianos. And the education was very tactile. So I love the photo that's up here. It's taxidermied animals from South America along with tactile maps. We still have a tactile museum today. It's still used by students because sometimes the best way to figure out what an anteater is like, or what a snake is like, or what what a piece of pottery is like, is to touch it. We also have some models made during the WPA era, including the Parthenon, where you can take the top off and feel what it's shaped like inside and where things are. So there's a big emphasis on being able to handle the things that you're learning about. Next slide, please. I always want to talk a little bit about the causes of blindness because they changed tremendously over the school's history. The information you can see up here is just a brief excerpt from the 1890 census. And the causes fall into roughly 3 categories. Injury is probably the most simple to explain. That includes blows to the head, falls, cannon, gunshot, piercing injuries. And because this is pre-antibiotics, any injury to one eye often led to sympathetic infection in the other eye, also causing blindness. Illness we are going to come back to in a minute. There was a huge concern about epidemic disease in the surrounding neighborhoods. And of course, the students came from all over the place, and so we're exposed to epidemic diseases, only one of which on this list we had a vaccination for at the time. So common causes of blindness included diphtheria, scarlet fever, measles, smallpox, chickenpox, brain fever, which is sometimes identified as meningitis and sometimes not, and just general inflammation. And then congenital causes, cataracts, hereditary complications, the physical structure of the eye not developing, and then one that has disappeared today, which is ophthalmia neonatorum, which is an infection of the eye usually caused by a sexually transmitted disease in the mother, often asymptomatic in the mother. So she did not know that she had this. And untreated, it causes blindness within a couple of weeks in a newborn baby. In 1903, silver nitrate drops were introduced to all babies in Massachusetts. And in the beginning of the 1900s, 25% of our students were blind due to this. And by 1913, only 1 student came in with that as the cause of blindness. So you can see that there's this tremendous change in the population in a decade. Next slide, please. I talked a little bit about the environment. So 2 blocks large spacious community spaces. You can see here one of the dining rooms. You can see a classroom with lots of natural light and these big glass cases, because again, we had all of these physical objects to learn with and you need to put them somewhere. And there's a group of students who are standing around a table about to study physiology is what the caption says. The school was near the ocean, which is going to be relevant for our physical training. And they were also able to walk to shops, to local churches, to musical concerts. They were very close to the center of Boston. Next slide. This brings us to our topic of the day. So the health concerns. There was this huge concern about the health of the students. And there were several reasons for this. When you read through the annual reports, as I did to prepare for this, they spend 50 years saying basically every year, the health of the school is remarkably good. The same thing over and over again. And at some point in there, I started going, why do they keep thinking it's remarkably good? Why they've been saying this for 20 years now? Like, what are they thinking about that is not good? And the answer is tuberculosis, which I'll talk about in a second. But the other answer is that students who are blind were often very much protected by their families. There are stories in the annual reports about children who were basically locked away in an attic because their parents were ashamed of them, or just very overprotective parents who didn't want their children to, walk around in the back garden and fall over something and get hurt. So they were often very coddled, is not a bad word here. And so you get these kids who did not move freely and who were not out in the fresh air and who were not integrated into family life. And that causes all sorts of health issues. And so once they got to the school, both Howe and Anagnos were very ardent about getting these kids out and moving. You can see from the photograph here that they did that with a vengeance. There's a large playground structure here that is 12 feet high. There are kids, there's about a dozen boys playing on it. They are climbing on top of the thing. One of them is walking across the top with no cares in the world. It's an open trellis work. They're hanging off of it. One of them swinging off a rope. This is not the most terrifying playground equipment we have photographs of. We have a thing called a trolley chase where they're hanging off a T-bar like a zip line 15 feet in the air. We have some terrifying rocking boats. This was all part of getting the kids to just be out and moving and independent. And as you can see, they were having a grand time. The annual reports do not report many broken bones, because we can tell this because they report when they happened, and there are a handful of them. There were, however, ongoing disease worries. So there were epidemics of scarlet fever, of diphtheria and measles sort of in the neighborhood regularly, and sometimes those would come into the school. And there's this ongoing concern about tuberculosis. And I was actually listening to a presentation from the Public Health Museum for World Tuberculosis Day a couple of weeks ago. And something clicked for me, which is that tuberculosis was identified as a bacterial disease in 1884. Before that, it was the sort of ambient, there's something bad here and we don't know what it is. And so there were things that we knew that helped, like fresh air and certain kinds of food. But it was this sort of 20% of the population in many years died of it. And it could be latent in your body for many years. So you see an ongoing concern about what they referred to at the time as either scrofula or consumption. And there are some ongoing deaths, but it's also this just general fear. And once you get to the later 1880s, they start talking about it differently, and they sort of realize that it is a disease and it's not a moral failing on the part of the kids or their families, that it's something they can do something about. And the language changes a bit, but they're still concerned about making sure all of their students get the best possible care. Next slide, please. What does that daily life look like? So this is from the 1878 report, which was unusually clear about what was going on. It involved an abundant and nourishing diet, which in this case meant vegetables, some meat, some dairy, some fruit, some grains. It meant fresh air by night as well as by day. They talk a lot about airing out the bedrooms every morning. Like you would take all the bedding off the bed, you would hang it up, you would air it out, let it all dry out, and then you would make the bed again. There's scrupulous cleanliness, bathing daily. We'll come back to that. There's sea bathing. We were very close to the ocean. People were bathing in the ocean sort of all spring and summer and well into the autumn. Daily walks were required. People complained about them, but they were required. There were gymnastic exercises in either the playground or gymnasium. And again, we're going to come back to that. And they sort of split the day up with 4 hours of study, 4 hours of handcrafts, making objects, partly to improve dexterity, and 2 or 3 hours of music on average. The photograph here is a deafblind student, Lily Elizabeth Robbins, and her teacher in their bedroom. And you can see that it's a very pleasant, it's not industrial. It's a very pleasant bedroom. There's lots of knickknacks. Their teacher's sitting at a desk, Lily's sitting in a rocking chair. There's various objects, but you can also see that there's big windows, and that was a big part of how do we manage the space. Next slide, please. Cold showers. So Howe was a huge proponent of cold showers for everybody all the time. And people did not like this. In 1872, there's a petition by students, and this is a copy of the petition, signed by about 65 students and staff, which was about half the population at the time. I'd have to check the precise numbers, complaining that they did not like this cold shower thing at all. And so a year or so later, Howe writes about it in the annual reports, and he says that he was insistent upon it because of the effect of it on arterial and general circulation. So again, this idea of improving vitality, improving health. And he goes on to talk about that it wasn't quite as bad as it sounds. They would draw the water up into the pipes, leave it overnight so it became room temperature. They would have a cold shower and then be sent to go stand in what we would think of as a sauna today, like a small room with a very, very hot stove. And they would observe the students carefully. And if it did not improve their circulation, they did not see the signs of it, working on their skin. They would exempt students for whom it was not a good idea. And he says that about 10 to 15% of students were exempted. But this was sort of one of the big scandals for the school for a while, this idea of you should have a cold shower. Next slide, please. And of course, we have physical training. So I was really interested by the dates in the earlier presentation because we were doing this physical training thing very early. There are references to it back in the late 1830s and 1840s. We don't have a very clear idea of what exactly they were doing other than this emphasis on walks and this emphasis on exercises. But by the 1870s, we built a new gymnasium in 1878. So a lot of the photos sort of come from around that time. But you can see that there's a group of girls here, and there are some on the floor doing physical exercises to improve their posture, sort of moving their arms in different ways. But there are also girls climbing a large pole. There's a whole set of them hanging off those racks on the side by the windows. And they were taken through a graded series of exercises to improve lung capacity, to improve mobility, to correct posture concerns that were causing them issues. It was very individualized. It was not just everybody doing the same thing all the time. The climbing was a big part of it to improve upper body strength. Sea bathing was a part of it, swimming, rowing boats, walking. They just wanted everybody to be as physically active as they could get them to be all the time, basically. Next slide. I wanted to keep this short, so I do want to let you all know that I am at jennifer.arnott@perkins.org. Or if you Google Hayes Research Library, Hayes, you will find me. The photos here all come from the Perkins Archives, which is at perkins.org/archives. My excellent colleagues there have a lot of additional context and materials. I work very closely with them, but the research library is functionally a little separate from the archives. And we also have lots of other things like annual reports and newspaper clippings. So if you're interested in Perkins, both we are very glad to help you with questions, and you can just browse stuff. There are some reference blog posts about the census, about the cold water bathing, and an article about that early history of autism. And I'm glad to send the links to anybody who would like them. But I will turn it over, and hope if you have questions later, please let us know.
We will. Thank you, Jennifer. I can't help but smile when I think about the cold water bathing. I think quite frankly of my friend Kostas, which we'll discuss later in some of the questions. In terms of the polls and things of that nature, I mean, I was fascinated by that discussion. Mm-hmm. And, to, again, Kostas' presentation, where he was talking about some of the first Olympic-type games prior to the modern Olympics. Pole climbing was one of the actual 4 or 5 different scenarios that they did. So thank you for that, and we'll get back to some questions, in particular relating to some of the activities that the children were having that almost seemed to come out of things of the Hellenic Revolution. I mean, this is very interesting presentation. Thank you. Our next presenter is Lisa Norberg. She joined the Cooper Union for the Advancement of Science and Art as the director of the library in 2020. She oversees the Cooper Archives and Special Collections and is responsible for collecting, preserving, and making accessible historically significant materials that reflect the institution's origins and development and the achievements of its officers, staff, faculty, students, and alumni. Prior to assuming her current role, she served in leadership positions at the Barnard College of Columbia University and the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. In 2013, she co-founded the Open Access Network, a nonprofit organization committed to finding sustainable solutions to open access publishing. She has published widely on the academic library's role in an open scholarly information ecosystem and has taught graduate courses at Pratt Institute School of Information and the School of Information and Library Science at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. She has received her MLS from Indiana University at Bloomington and her BS in Political Science from the University of Wyoming. Welcome, Lisa, and thank you for being with us today. You can unmute yourself if you can. Thanks.
Thank you, Lou. It's a pleasure to be with you this afternoon. The presentations so far have been just fascinating. I looked at the impact of the Hellenic Revolution on wellness through education and social justice, as personified, if you will, by John Zachos. Before I begin, I would also just like to thank my colleague Dale Perot, who conducted extensive archival research for me and provided invaluable help. Let's see if I could have the slides. Thank you. And I'll go ahead and go to the next slide. Thank you. John Zachos was born in 1820, just a year shy of the start of the Greek Revolution for independence, but it left an indelible mark. His father, a prosperous merchant and loyal member of the revolutionary society that actually instigated the revolt, was killed in battle in 1824. The Hellenistic Revolution, as many of our speakers have noted, exposed the oppressive treatment of Greeks, especially women and those sold into slavery. At the time, it also highlighted the appreciation Americans and Western Europeans had for Greek culture and the international support for the cause of independence. Most notably, as many have mentioned, the renowned British poet Lord Byron famously perished in the war. Next slide, please. But it was another well-known Philhellenist, American physician Samuel Gridley Howe, who Jennifer and others have mentioned, that would play a defining role in Zachos' life. While John's mother soon remarried, she remained fearful for her son's safety and his future in the war-torn country. So she entrusted her son to Howe, who took him along with a handful of other refugee children back to America to be educated. They arrived in New York in February of 1828, quickly went to Boston, where they secured John a seat at the Mount Pleasant Classical Institute in Amherst, Massachusetts. He was 7 years old at this time. He later moved to Pennsylvania, where he attended the Bristol Manual Labor College just outside of Philadelphia. Connections at this Episcopalian institution led to another institution. Zachos traveled from Pennsylvania to Ohio, where he attended Kenyon College. There he studied literature and languages and developed a particular penchant for Shakespeare. Likely influenced by his guardian and mentor, Samuel Gridley Howe, Zachos went on to study medicine at Miami University in Oxford, Ohio. While from time to time he would fall back on his medical training, he lacked the passion to really pursue it as a career. Next slide, please. Instead, he moved to Cincinnati, where he founded a Shakespearean society. He met, married, and fathered 6 children with Harriet Tompkins Canfield, and discovered his true passion as an educator. He became a teacher and administrator at the Cincinnati Women's Seminary, which ignited a drive to advance the education of young women and girls. He organized the Association for the Advancement of Female Education, and he advocated for the inclusion of math and classics in the education of girls. Up to that point, only boys were allowed to study those subjects. Next slide, please. In 1862, as the US became embroiled in its own civil war, Zachos would take on one of the most challenging assignments of his life. He and a handful of other educators participated in one of the most important social and educational experiments of the time, known as the Port Royal Experiment. For 2 years, Zachos worked tirelessly on a small island of Paris, located just off of South Carolina, in an effort to prove that Black men, women, and children could be educated. He was in charge of 5 cotton plantations and over 400 soon-to-be freed slaves. He served as planter, preacher, teacher, and doctor, essentially tending to their every need. He understood that education was critical, not only for gaining and maintaining their freedom, but to becoming equal and productive members of society. He also recognized that they needed to be taught self-respect as much as reading. After his service in the Civil War ended, he traveled to Boston, where he became a Unitarian minister, then found himself once again in New York City, where he had landed first as a young Greek immigrant. Next slide, please. Now 51, Zachos had developed a reputation for being a champion of women's education, a committed abolitionist, a devoted Unitarian, and a passionate author and inventor. Next slide, please. So it's probably no coincidence that he would find himself in the company of Peter Cooper, another champion of women's education, a committed abolitionist, a devout Unitarian, and a passionate author and inventor in his own right. Next slide, please. Clearly, these were kindred spirits. So Peter Cooper recruited Zachos to the Cooper Union for the Advancement of Science and Art, encouraging him to write to his son-in-law, Abram Hewitt, who was serving as president of the school at the time, to secure a position. Next slide, please. Zachos found a home at the Cooper Union. Next slide, please. And a new stage at the Cooper Union's Great Hall. Home to many prominent speakers, the Great Hall would prove to be a perfect venue in which to showcase Zachos' impressive oratory skills. And as you can see, he also encountered a new classroom. New York City at the time was teeming with new immigrants and migrants, men and women eager to improve their lot through education and training. Next slide. To ensure Zachos received sufficient income to support his family, he took on the role of curator of the Cooper Union Library and Reading Room, which I can assure you makes me feel wholly inadequate. His are big shoes to fill. The Cooper Union Reading Room was one of the few that was open to both men and women at the time, and its hours extended into the evening to reach the broadest possible audience. He carefully selected a range of reading material that would both entertain and enlighten. Next slide, please. In addition to his role as curator, Zachos served as professor of English literature, introducing Cooper students and the broader public to the works of Shakespeare, Milton, Dickens, just to name a few. Next slide. But it was his exceptional oratory skills and his work in the area of elocution that Zachos was most noted for. During what is known as the golden age of oratory, Zachos understood that the practice of speaking was not only an instrument for conducting business and political discourse, it was a means of public education and a mode of creative expression. Eloquence made one the master of one's own destiny, and he saw it as a critical skill. Next slide, please. In this regard, and in the parlance of today, John Zachos was an influencer. His lectures packed the seats of the Great Hall, and his choice of reading materials filled the writing room. TikTok, Twitter, and Instagram would have nothing on John Zachos. As William Cullen Bryant noted after attending one of Zachos' lectures, the reading rooms in schools are always full, and hundreds of people are on the list of candidates for the schools waiting for vacancies. Next slide, please. Like Peter Cooper, Zachos was also an innovator. He took his theories on phonetics and applied them to type, receiving a patent for his approach to typewriting and phonetic notation. Next slide, please. During his tenure at the Cooper Union, he became one of Peter Cooper's closest friends and most trusted allies. He drafted one of the first biographies of Peter Cooper and was one of his most loyal supporters during Cooper's run for the presidency. Zachos believed, as Cooper did, that equal rights for all was equivalent to the preservation of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Next slide. Zachos left an enduring legacy that was continued by his daughter, Helena Zachos, who succeeded her father at the Cooper Union as both a professor of English and a teacher of elocution. She coached the Cooper Union debate team and conducted evening classes for adults on public speaking. Next slide. As biographer Eva Topping wrote of John Zachos, the world was his schoolroom, humanity his subject, the perfection of the human soul through freedom and education his single purpose. A purpose that I would argue was clearly influenced by his Greek origins and the impact of the Hellenic Revolution. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that. And obviously looking at those drawings, and certainly of the school, et cetera, brings back memories to me. We did have programs relating to the orphans of the revolution, which John was one of them. And it's really fascinating. It's really fascinating how these orphans, how accomplished many of them became. And what was very interesting is just about every one of them was an abolitionist. You know, just about every one of them was involved in women's rights. You know, at the very beginning. So you know, when you were talking about his work with women, you know, I was thinking of Emma Willard, for example, who not only founded the first, you know, women's, let's say, college, if you will, but who also founded schools in Greece after the revolution to teach young ladies to become teachers, etc. And I have to believe that Samuel Gridley Howe and certainly Miller, because you know, Miller also, who was in the revolution, also an abolitionist, also adopted Lucas Miltiades, who himself became the first Hellenic-American congressperson in the United States. I have to believe that they influenced and were influenced by many people. In other words, we talk about each one of them individually, But the reality is they were linked. All these people were linked to each other. I'm sure that that Zachos was talking to all types of people, including at the Perkins School. So thank you for that. Sotiria, I've taken over most of the discussion. If you yourself have any questions that you would like us to ask of some of the panelists, it would be great. Thank you.
Yeah, no, I think, I mean, it paints a really interesting picture of what the effect of the revolution had on the United States culture, and I would say even internationally, right? It's incredible when you actually step back and see what downstream effects have occurred because of these changes and because of the influences on so many people, so many influential people, such as Zachos and Howe. And I'm still very impressed that Howe actually left as a physician in the US and went and picked up, as part of the martyrdom and the work that was being done by the Greeks, but then to also then take so many kids back and bring them. But it's interesting to me how Zachos, who came at a very young age, was already influenced enough to be able to make this sort of impact and bring back with him this sort of information. I think what you were saying, Lou, is really important, because what we wind up seeing is the solitary view, an individualistic view of their accomplishments. But what we don't see is that spherical picture of all things happening because of interactions with other Greeks that had also at the time had come back, and all that influence in general, how it changed and impacted so many viewpoints and so many things that could be done. And how many things have since have actually occurred because of that influence. I mean, with the Perkins School, it's just amazing. And Jennifer, listening to you, and bringing back all these things that were done to the school. I mean, for you, how do you think that the biggest impact of their background, sort of set in motion what was going to happen at the School for Blind?
Oh, it's an incredibly complicated question. So Howe was on very good terms with most of the progressive educators, certainly in Boston and in other places. He went on honeymoon with Horace Mann and his new wife, like that level of close. Yeah. He was very connected with Lucy Wheelock, who founded what became Wheelock College, which sort of focused on early education. So they were all talking, and trying to figure that out is tremendously complicated, because we often only sort of have fragments of what we have as the note where they say, well, I see you on Thursday for this meeting, and we don't always know what they talked about. Or that we only know it because we were looking for something else and we came across this letter. Nobody's done a full analysis. There's an excellent biography of Howe that gets into some of this by James Trent called The Manliest Man, which I recommend if you're at all interested in Howe. But even there, he doesn't have space to get into, the full breadth of what happened with education.
And this is a man who, had a horrible experience in Boston Latin, right? I mean, just hated school himself, and then becomes an influencer of education.
Yes.
Over time. So it's quite impressive.
And he was so committed to people, and listening to Lisa talk about the classics education. Our kids were learning Latin. We have evidence of Helen Keller learning both Latin and Greek. A little bit later, but doing that. They took geography, they took natural science, they took math, they took all of these subjects that were sort of core to the classical education and the way that we were familiar with it, despite being blind. And Howe was just like, that's what education looks like. You're just going to do this, and figured out how to make it work.
Can we talk about Sotirios? Can we talk a little bit about some of the aspects? By the way, everybody can unmute, because this is like an open discussion. We're just chatting right now. So whoever wants to talk, whatever in the discussion. But one of the things that I was fascinated about is all these things that were set up in terms of health, Kostas, in terms of light, in terms of air, in terms of salt water, in terms of food, your diet, in terms of this cold shower, Kostas, which I want to discuss with you. Tell me a little bit about the cold shower, Costa, because I know there's got to be something Greek in this thing.
Oh, okay. So Lou is referring to the fact that I routinely take baths in ice. That's a Japanese influence, although
We're going to make it Greek. We're going to make it
well,
Greek.
no. But let me get there. The ice thing is Japanese. The cold water is not. There is not a boy who grew up in Papingo who doesn't swim in freezing water. Okay, our water from our river is 4 degrees. It's melted ice. And as kids, we are brought to a small stream and told to swim in it, because otherwise we're maimeno, this type of thing. We are berated if we don't go into the cold water. So, and the men were doing it on a routine basis because they were fishing in the stream at the time. So when I went to Japan and did this Buddhist meditation in ice water, for me it was easy because I grew up that way. It wasn't as big of a shock to me as some other Westerner, and I continue it because it was a practice in the 19th century, late 19th century, early 20th century in Greece. But the interesting thing is, apparently Dr. Howe applied it much before. I thought it was something that Anagnos had brought to Perkins, but apparently Dr. Howe had brought it in himself, which is very, very interesting. It seems that I believe a lot of these things gestated through neoclassicism, as I pointed out earlier. For me, it's to talk about cold water bathing. It's not so much an effect on the circulatory system like a massage as it is a surrender. So for me, it's neurological. You go into the water and you listen to yourself and you control your autonomic nervous system to the extent where you can keep your core temperature okay, and then you're fine. I mean, I do typically 30 minutes to 45 minutes in ice water without stressing myself. I normally read a book or my Kindle tablet when I do that, and that freaks people out because they have to go through all this regime. But I've been doing it for a long time. But the world record is something like 3 hours now, so it's it's far away from that. But the point is that this is an excellent means to introduce young children not only with their circulatory systems but also with their neurology. And because if you surrender to the water, you find that in many respects you can tell your body to warm up. And for me, interestingly enough, as a kid, it was my father who told me that. He goes, just go in there and let yourself warm up, and you'll be fine. So that
there is Kostas, there is a paradoxical effect, right? One that we can't seem to understand. It does promote vitality to a certain extent. We actually tell people that work out, it's best for it afterwards. And like I said before, I have an association with athletics much more than I thought I would have.
I understand.
We currently put, we actually ice baths, and it's hysterical how there is a certain healing effect, especially on strained muscle, that allows for that to happen. But at the same token, if you look in surgeries, and Evangelos can actually confirm this or not, we drop patients' core temperatures in certain situations for purpose of, there's like senescence and somnolence of being able to get their body to a point where it stays almost, at a position where it's unchanged. And that's what Walt Disney did, right? He froze himself supposedly with the thought that, hey, I could sleep for about 40 years. And when you guys come up with, any new solutions for me, bring me back. So there is this paradoxical sort of thought about what its abilities could do and how much it can actually help, whether, in the short term versus the long term, I imagine. But I have a tendency to agree with you. Even my little one, 8 years old, he says, we should be working out in the cold. It builds your muscles. I said, why don't you go do that, and I'll just watch from inside.
I think there's an evolutionary consideration somewhere along the line, because we did evolve through an ice age, but that would be a discussion that I'd like to interject. No, let's not go there. I'd like to interject. If we could look at Lisa's presentation, I'd like to make a point about something on the drawing of Zachos. If we could we possibly put that up again?
Kostas, they're talking to you.
Yeah, Konstantinos, sorry. If you could put up
can you put up
Lisa's
Lisa's
Lisa
presentation?
Norberg's presentation once again.
The last one, Kostas. Is he with us or no?
I don't know.
He might be on break.
Yeah.
Maybe he went to get some water or something. But
All right.
but
Okay.
there's. Let me just refer to it. So I wanted to make it more like use the Socratic method to see if you could identify what I saw. But one of the things in Hellenic combatives is single weighting. And what that means is you transfer the weight from leg to leg. And the reason for that is uneven terrain. And it's actually something that was very popular in the 19th century, popular in the sense that all fighting arts and anything to do with martial education utilized this single weighting. It's evident in Greek dance, for example. And as floors became flat and cities became flat, and parquet was used instead of uneven ground in training, this went away, and now we double weight. We spread our weight evenly. But you can still see this type of influence in ballet, where they go from toe to toe, etc., and so forth. But what I saw in the drawings of Zachos, which was interesting, he was single weighting. His posture was upright. There were 3 different depictions where he was moving his hand, but in each case, he had his weight on one leg. Okay. So I wonder, I can't help but wonder, because I'm a Greek, and I know that this is very much evident in Greek martial arts, but also very much evident in Greek dance. And for me, the two are intertwined. So, young kids were taught to fight by first learning to dance. And the reason for that is when you're running up and down on uneven ground, you have to transfer your weight from foot to foot. You can't slide. You'll fall down. In fact, there's a story where I beat somebody who was a very dear friend and a much better swordsman than me, but I beat him by asking him to go outside, and he dragged his foot Japanese style, and then he fell down, and I beat him. But yeah. So, but the point of the matter is, I'm very curious if Zachos brought this through him from his Hellenic dance training as a child, which we all do. We all grow up dancing. It's the first thing we do. Maybe when we're 9 months to a year, we learn how to walk, and then when we're 2 years old, we're all dancing Greek dances. I wonder if he brought this type of single weighting, which you can see in Lisa's slides, with him to the States, and then subsequently passed that on as elocution and orthophonics to his students, which would be, for me, wonderful, and yeah, go team type of thing.
Well, you never know. You never know, Costa. First of all, don't forget that when let's think about how Zachos and Anagnos. Okay, one was adopted by Howe. The other one was Howe's son-in-law. Right. Obviously, these people knew. Obviously, they knew each other from from the time, I guess, even Zachos was a kid. He knew Howe. He knew Anagnos, etc. So. And they were for poppycock. Maybe he was used to that one-legged scenario. I don't,
well, maybe Anagnos, but Zachos, I don't know. But
no. But don't forget, Zachos was adopted.
Yeah, he was adopted, but
he absolutely knew Anagnos.
He absolutely knew them. Yes, absolutely knew them. Yes, there's no question about that. But the effect, I wonder if it was just generic Greek dance, Kalamatianos, or something that he perceived from this type of movement.
It's quite possible. You briefly, Lisa, you briefly talked about Julia Ward. Everybody says Julia Ward, his wife, and she herself was the most fascinating individual, quite frankly. What did she add to the picture in your mind? I'm sorry, I'm Jennifer. My apologies.
Yeah, Jennifer. Sorry.
Yeah. My apologies.
So they had a very contentious marriage.
Yes.
There's a book, and am blanking on the author's name, but it's The Civil Wars of Julia Ward Howe. Came out a couple of years ago, and it's about their marriage. She did not care for Perkins as an institution very much. She thought Howe was very tied up in it. He did not like her writing things. She published, a number of poems. She's best known for the Battle Hymn of the Republic, but she wrote a number of other essays and poems and all sorts of other things. Their daughters actually wrote the first Pulitzer Prize winning biography, like the first time anybody awarded a prize, the Pulitzer Prizes, they won it for their biography of Julia. So like the entire family is just fascinating. But she was very focused on both abolitionist movement and on suffragette, early suffrage movement, feminism in all of its forms at that point.
Her father, if I'm not mistaken, her father also not adopted a Hellenic boy or anything, but he helped with his schooling, if I'm not mistaken.
I don't know off the top of my head, but that sounds right. Yeah.
And she always referred to her Greek brother. In other words, someone that the father had actually adopted, not adopted, but actually paid for to go to school, because her father was a banker.
Yes.
Her father was a banker, correct?
Yeah,
as a matter of fact,
so.
he was
very well off family.
He was very well off. And as a matter of fact, one of her sisters, I think, married one of the richest people, the son of one of the richest people, like the Astors, I think. So these were all people that were all interlinked in all types of crazy ways that I don't think anyone has connected yet, by the way. I think that there's a lot of stuff written about these people, but I don't think anyone has connected all these different linkages of all these people, and actually how the Hellenic Revolution had a tremendous effect on America in very strange ways that nobody even knows about. I think it's a fascinating topic. We're going to try to wrap it up. Are there any questions from anyone else, or the presenters would like to ask any questions of the other presenters?
I just wanted to know, and maybe Evangelos will be able to help us on this. There's been so little change of medicine, surgically especially, in wartime, from I would say the Greek Revolution till maybe World War II. I don't think there were significant advancements. I think they were still very basic. And I think you and I, Lou, we talked about this a little bit. It was more of a guild back then than it was actually a medical science. So I'm wondering what came out of, let's say, the Hellenic Revolution that we think would have been contributory to medicine and to surgery. In World War II, shock was finally, they found a way to be able to treat shocks, from blood loss and whatnot. But let's say from there, do we have any evidence of any changes? Kostas, maybe but I'm just wondering.
No, I don't think so. And just because during the Hellenic Revolution, the medicine, the status of the medicine in Greece was very low. We didn't have many doctors. It was very, very low. At that period of time, probably in England and Middle Europe, it was a proper medicine. They used to have in UK colleges, they used to have a proper training. In Greece, we had nothing. We relied only to experiment plants that we used to put on the wounds and nothing else. So probably someone would say that during the Hellenic Revolution, medicine was hidden and was not revealed until later on, probably the First Balkans War or the Second World War, or probably when we had the first medical school in Greece, probably during after King Otto years, probably that was the first medical school in Greece, in Athens. But before that, it was nothing.
But there's a history, and Kostas, you and I
actually, let me jump in there and correct Evangelos. So he's right. Heinrich Treiber was the German that you mentioned early on, Lou, that did some of the original battle surgery. But they understood very early on that the effects that illness was having amongst the soldiers. So actually, the first operation with ether was done in the States in 1847, and the second was done by Treiber in Athens in 1847, a few months later. So they were very close. So Heinrich Treiber was in fact made the chief surgeon by Otto, okay, Othona, and then he was retired, quote unquote, when Othonos was deposed. But I think that the tradition he imposed of military medicine, trying to follow the cutting edge of what was going on, was followed, because in the Balkan Wars, what Evangelos was saying, one of the reasons our troop won was they were vaccinated for cholera, and the Turks were not. So there was a massive vaccination program that had been instituted prior to the first Balkan Wars, so that our boys, when they went into the fight, they did not get sick, whereas epidemics raged throughout the opposition, contributing to our easy victory at the time.
But let's talk about vaccinations for a second. And you and I, of course, I talked about inoculations and things of that nature that actually started way before in our areas, right, and actually spread into Europe and into the into doctors who were started to practice it in Western Europe by learning what took place in Constantinople, for example, as early as the 1600s.
I think it was 1712, if I remember. I don't have it handy at the moment when the publication
it was in the late 16. The first discussion that was anybody talked about had to do with some Greek lady who was inoculating people during, I think, a plague of 1690 something, and she was very successful. And as a matter of fact, the writings in the West came later on the basis of the things that were observed in the East.
That's correct, Lou. It was called variolation, if I remember correctly. And there were two types of smallpox, one that was deadly and the other that was less effective. And again, I'm quoting from memory, and I'm not a physician, so please, doctors, jump in.
It's actually what the interesting aspect is. What she came around doing without realizing it is what the whole understanding of inoculation is you actually take viral particle that is not dangerous of replicating within your system and causing a fulminant disease, and taking that, introducing it into your body to allow for a reaction to it where it will cause a memory that anytime it sees it, it goes after it, right? So what she did was so grotesquely basic without realizing what she was doing. But at the same token, could have went either way. If there was some damaging particles of this virulent, strain that she would bring into, God knows how many people she would have killed. But she was fortunate enough to be able to start the first inoculating.
Listen, I remember when I was a child, and I must be the last generation of this, but in the old days, up in our villages in the mountains, the parents used to give their children like a combination of various poisons, whether it was snake poison or whatever. And they would actually give it to them as children, diluted, of course, thinking that
in Greek wine.
No. In other words, it's sort of a thing like if you got bit by a snake, hey, you had the snake poison in your stream. Any truth to that or no?
Don't look at me on that one. I have no clue. That might be a regional thing, let's say.
All right, guys, listen, thank you. This was an absolute, fascinating discussion with a great panel. Thank you, Sotirios, for co-hosting and being a co-moderator. To our audience, thank you for being with us. Subscribe to our YouTube channel so you can get the latest of whatever events we're having. Our next event is going to be on the Hellenic Revolution and its effects on the American women's suffrage movement. and that's going to be on May the 23rd. For those who want to find out more about our programs, EMBCA.com, EMBCA.com. And for those who want to find out a little bit more about AHEPA, it's AHEPA, ahepa.org on the internet. Thank you again, and thank you to this wonderful panel, and for us sharing a few laughs also. Thanks again, guys. Take care.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.